Hey everyone, welcome. If you're just joining, we're going to do a little icebreaker in the chat. So feel free to just drop in maybe where you're joining us from and what you're drinking, if you happen to be drinking an interesting beverage at this time. And we'll get started in a couple minutes. Awesome. I see we're a few minutes in here, so I think we will go ahead and get started. But yes, let's keep the locations that you're joining us from and also the yummy beverages going in the chat. Thanks, Zach, for kicking us off. Awesome. So I wanted to start by saying hello and welcome to this panel. We're super excited to be hosting this conversation today on the road to broader adoption for Web3 projects. My name is Pooja and I work on the Filecoin project. And our panelists today are very knowledgeable on this subject and have been working for a long time to help a wide variety of products, projects, and companies achieve success in a number of different industries, and most recently also in Web3. I think this is going to be a really awesome and very interesting and educational conversation for all of us. So without further ado, let's introduce our panelists. During today's conversation, we'll be hearing from Shikai of Longhash Ventures, Gabriel Anderson of Consensus Tachyon, and Colin Everin from the Filecoin project. Shikai is Chief Operating Officer at Longhash Ventures, where he's responsible for the operational excellence and management of the company's blockchain acceleration and investment outreach. Hey, welcome and thanks for joining. A little bit more here, Shikai spearheads the development and rollout of Longhash Hatch program and has raised over $20 million in funding to date for this program. Super awesome. Shikai was also previously a management consultant at McKinsey with a focus on digital transformation and analytics across the financial and telecom sectors in Southeast Asia, and also holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Imperial College in London. So awesome. Thank you so much for joining. Great. And then we also have Gabriel, who is the managing director of Tachyon, the premier accelerator for early stage Web3 startups. He's a serial entrepreneur with specialties in early stage growth, customer acquisition, and business development. He's built and advised numerous companies that have gone on to successfully raise and or exit in both Web 2 and Web 3, and also is a taco lover. So it's great. Also love tacos. Awesome. And then lastly, Colin Everin is the ecosystem lead for the Filecoin project. He's helped grow our large community of miners, clients, collaborators, and projects that are contributing to the Filecoin ecosystem. He's been with Protocol Labs for over 3 years in a variety of ecosystem and operational roles. Previously, Colin was also the founder and CEO of Yard Club, which is a marketplace for underutilized industrial assets. And Colin began his career as a consultant at McKinsey as well, and an associate at Bain & Capital, and has received an MBA from the Stanford GSB and a BA from the Richard Ivey School of Business. So amazing. Thank you all so much for being here. Now that you're all here, we'd love to get your videos on so everyone can see your faces. Awesome. Great. So I figured we could maybe just, jump in. There are a number of really interesting questions and topics around the space of adoption. I think it's a huge category. But I wanted to start maybe with just getting your take on just the place that Web3 is in right now. I think this whole industry is in a really interesting place. We're continuing to see an explosion of new projects at all layers of the Web3 stack. That's layer 1 blockchains, all sorts of layer 2 projects, user-facing applications, dev tools, and more. And I think more recently, we've probably seen more of a focus on kind of these user-facing applications. I'd also include some of the really successful recent DeFi projects in that category potentially. So I was thinking it would be great to just maybe start with a round robin. I'm curious from each of you, how would you characterize this period in the life cycle of Web3 as an industry? And maybe Gabriel, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think I've probably I've had the opportunity to develop kind of a unique insider instinct around this. We're currently, as you know, working with a group of 13 founders who are building around the IPFS Filecoin Stack, early stage companies. Our previous cohort was all around open finance and DeFi, and certainly, I think we're starting to see kind of the foundation of Web3 being built around kind of this decentralized finance movement. It's certainly been exciting to see that kind of skyrocket and take off, especially for somebody who spent years of a misspent youth in traditional finance. I think it's really interesting to see that because finance is kind of like this this bedrock that touches every other industry, right? The movement of money allows all kinds of and enables all kinds of new industries, commerce, et cetera. But now it feels like a lot of those foundational pieces have been built, and now it's really exciting to start to see some of the early use cases of what I would call these Web 2 to Web 3 bridges, right? So companies that are not pure crypto, not pure Web3, but they're kind of a bridge from the Web2 ecosystems into the Web3 ecosystems. And I think there are a lot of interesting places where we're seeing companies build around, touching real consumers and real customers. So it's happening. We're not quite there yet as far as true product market fit, I think, for the Web3 ecosystem. But yeah, this is the first time that I've really felt like, okay, this is actually going to start to touch people outside of the Web3 ecosystem at some point.
Awesome. Yeah, totally agree. Those Web 2 to Web 3 bridges and DeFi are just awesome and have driven a huge amount of adoption from folks, I think, who are definitely really new to the space. So it's been really amazing to see that. Yeah, I mean, Shikai and Colin, what do you think? How would you characterize this period in the life cycle of Web3?
Should I go first or Colin?
Go for it.
All right. So similarly with Gabriel, I think we're at a very exciting time, although still very early in the whole life cycle of Web3. If you look at it from the grand scale, I think most recently, everybody has been really optimistic because of the developments in decentralized finance. I think that is actually proof of the very early kind of you can say it's the minimum viable ecosystem for a group of applications to start emerging because of the work that's been done over the past couple of years, all the infrastructure, all the tooling, all the primitives that have been coming up, and now you can get some of these applications start to take off. So we're really excited about this, and I think it converges with the early validation of some of the mechanisms that are also more effective, right? Back then, when it was just everybody printing their own money and selling ICOs, it was also that proved to be not very sustainable, as we can see. And now I feel we're getting a little bit closer to what Web3 could be in terms of building the communities that are actually contributing to the various networks that we are creating. So I think overall, still very early, but moving rapidly towards the adoption cycle, given the maturing infrastructure and mechanisms and people.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I like to use the crossing the chasm framework as one kind of way to look at the space. And I still think we're in the innovators, early adopters segments. Like we have yet to cross that chasm to the other side. And I actually do believe that the underlying protocols in Web3 are now reaching the point of scalability and functionality. When you look at ETH2 and Polkadot and NTFS and Filecoin, all of those, that base layer is right there where we are ready to cross that chasm. And what's missing is the UX for the average users and for developers to be able to build the killer applications that can be used by millions and hopefully billions of people in the short term. And I think we're right on the cusp there, that those applications are starting to take hold, that we can use that UX to cross that chasm. And what I'm most optimistic about is programs like Longcash and Tachyon and others that recruit, the quality and quantity of founders and developers that this space needs to be able to accelerate past that chasm into the majority. And I really think we're right on the cusp there. The kinds of quality founders and developers and entrepreneurs I'm seeing in the space are unlike I've seen in the last 3 years, and they continue to flood in. And those folks will create the kind of UX and application quality that we need to get to the next stage.
Yeah, totally agree. I think these are great points to bring up. And I'm curious as we think about moving from a little bit more of this focus on the underlying protocols, and we're starting to see protocols that can support real scale across a number of different foundational pieces of like the computing infrastructure of Web3. Yeah, so this focus that you mentioned, Colin, on UX, both for average users and developers. What are some examples of projects that you think have really nailed this so far in the space, or you think have the potential to nail this? What are some of the things that you think these teams have done really well, and what can the broader ecosystem learn from some of these projects? Colin, I don't know if anything immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, I think there's two kind of like categories for me. One is just unbelievable user experiences where you would use it in a Web 2 or Web 3 context. You don't even know what the underlying infrastructure is, and there are just a ton of applications that are starting to reach that level of quality. Audius, is kind of like a music streaming application. You would not be able to tell that's on Web 3 tech. It's just like such a high quality experience that it's just unbelievable. And then the other category is like a whole set of use cases that have been enabled by Web 3 that could not necessarily exist in a Web 2 context. I think DeFi that Gabriel mentioned is like a perfect industry that encapsulates that. When I think of Filecoin, like what I've been working on for the last little while, it's not really about like Filecoin disrupting, AWS or Google Cloud to me. When I look at the market, there's 95% of data that gets created in the world that currently does not get stored in any kind of context. And there are reasons behind that. It's either too expensive, or you need someone's permission, or you need to be a company in order to store that file, et cetera. And so how does Filecoin enable, not necessarily compete with the 5% of data that's currently stored, but enable the 95% of data that isn't stored to find a home? Right. And so to me, that second bucket is super interesting, like use cases that these protocols enable that just cannot actually exist in a Web 2 context. And that's one particular area I'm super, super interested in.
Totally agree. Yeah, I mean, Shikai and Gabriel, as you're running these programs for exactly these sorts of projects, I'm curious kind of the split you're seeing, whether it's these kind of Web 2 type style products that are enabled by Web 3 technologies, or projects that are really just trying to take advantage of some of the unique features of Web 3. If you could give us some examples of that, and maybe like what are some of the actual differentiating features that these projects are really leaning into that are uniquely enabled in this industry.
Yeah, I'll go first.
Okay.
So, in Web 2, in the start, seeing, everybody likes to talk about product market fit, but successful companies are built to solve a problem. And most startups never really find the problem that they're trying to solve, and that's especially true in Web3, right? Like, it doesn't matter what the question is; the answer is always the same. It's like whatever cool tech that you're working on, right? It's it's fair token launches. Which isn't actually the answer to my question. It's just like the thing that's happening right now. Or most startups, especially in our space, they find annoyances, they find generalities, they don't find specifics. I think what we're starting to see, at least with this program, is there's some real use cases that I think what Colin was saying earlier, that could have only been possible because of the underlying technology stack. But you don't need to explain blockchain to the end user. All they know is that they're getting a better product or a better service at a better price as a result of the underlying technology. And so those are the companies that I've been really thinking about a lot, especially as we're entering into this program. And there's a couple that I could give you just rattle off. I mean, there's a company that's that has this really unique insight in this upcoming batch, that everybody, whether you know it or not, everybody has digital assets, and there's a real issue with inheriting your digital assets, and there's real value there. And so they're sweeping the blockchain, or they're sweeping the blockchain tech under the rug so that the consumer doesn't really have to interact with it, but they're creating a seamless experience for the end user to be able to pass on their digital assets. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's now starting to happen around video transcription services, right? So especially as you start thinking about, this environment, this context that we find ourselves in right now, this COVID environment, you've got a number of users who are in emerging markets, who are engaging in e-learning platforms. Well, if you have really bad latency, low latency in your video product, that becomes a real issue. And we're talking about markets with billions of users, billions of people. They don't have to know the underlying technology stack that's enabling this. All they need to know is that the latency issue has been solved, and has been solved at a fraction of the price of one of the traditional video transcription companies. So yeah, this is like where I start to get really interested. It's like trying to sniff out the real problem for the end user, the end customer. And your tech is not, nobody really cares about your technology or your stack. You do as a developer maybe, but your customer doesn't. All they care about is did you solve their problem, and did you solve it at a price point that makes sense to them?
Yep, totally.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Shikai.
Yeah, totally agree with that, and totally echo the sentiment that so many founders are speaking, especially in the Web3 ecosystem, are like, wow, this is so cool. Like, wow, I want to decentralize everything, or like, I wanted to build a whole Web3 ecosystem. But like, that shouldn't be the starting point. Like, the starting point is like, what is the problem in the world that you're trying to solve? Either some a pain point that really touches a lot of people very frequently, or something that touches like very deeply that like nobody has been able to solve yet, or like they're feeling so much pain like for a certain group of people or a certain niche. So for us, like, I think that has always been the case, like blockchain kind of a solution looking for a problem. But one, I think, area of demand that has been super clear over the past few years is the need for digital assets, the demand for digital assets, like driven by, I think, the adoption of Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on. I think that has spawned, I think you can see like the first companies that really found the kind of product market fit were indeed like the miners, the exchanges, right, the wallets. And then, so those were the ones that grew organically. And then from there, once people have digital assets, once they're more familiar with the tools, then they need hardware wallets, they need software wallets, they need browser wallets, then they'll start to need stable coins to then do the exchanges. So then like that was kind of the second wave. And now like with those things, I feel that it is much easier okay, now I have DeFi, but like in order to get there, I needed digital assets, I needed MetaMask, I needed all those things to be in place before I can do that. So now I can say that, okay, if I want to do lending or borrowing, now I can say, okay, compared to traditional bank as well, now I don't need to go through all that, so much paperwork, so much time. I can just do it within a few clicks, even though it takes quite a few steps, but it's way better compared to the substitute. And that's what we always like to compare. We always like to say, okay, we're so much better compared to the other blockchain project. But no, what is your traditional industry, normal life substitute that you're replacing or disrupting? How much is it better? How much cheaper, faster, more effective is it? So that's where we like to benchmark.
That's really interesting. Actually, it makes me think of a podcast I listened to recently, where someone was talking about how just the world, even absent like Web3, the world in general is starting to find more value in these kind of like fractionalized marketplaces for all sorts of assets. Obviously, crypto enables this, or like Web3 enables this at a level of granularity that is maybe much harder to do in other sorts of industries, or just like Web2 in general. But I am curious, trying to marry these concepts a little bit, because we're talking sort of about, obviously there are generally, for most things, there is a substitute that exists in the world. But for some things like these like these digital asset like sorts of solutions, what is the substitute that people are trying to build for? Or is it just like really a completely novel solution that is trying to like maybe identify a need that people don't fully know that they have, but there's an opportunity there, and now like all of these builders in the space are trying to expose those opportunities to users potentially. Yeah, do you think that these solutions are like disrupting some sort of existing substitute, or is it like fundamentally new? What do you think, Shikai?
Yeah, so I think like Colin mentioned, there are some projects that are trying to build certain things or make certain real life use cases just much more efficient, right? Like, and we see it in like storage and all these examples. We see it in the financial sector, people using these private blockchains for like just more transparent and like faster settlement. Like that's okay as well. In the past, we have also accelerated startups who are in the energy sector, in the supply chain, and all these are pretty good. But then, well, if we think about like what's going to take off, well, if we look at parallels between the internet age and now, like the companies that really took off, like the Googles and Facebooks and the Amazons, well, I know we're trying to disrupt them as well, but these were what we call like the internet native companies. And so I think that's where we talk about where like there is no substitute, or the substitute is that like I have to go through a lot of pain of, let's say, issuing equity to all my employees and the paperwork for that, or like incorporating a company and like all the processes that come with that, right? And so instead of doing that, what can a token achieve? What can this kind of like decentralized network achieve in collaboration? Like those are use cases that don't have a substitute and are therefore much riskier, but also means that there's a lot more potential for growth and experimentation. So it's a bit harder to pin down those particular use cases, but indeed we think like that's where the biggest potential will lie. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think it's great. And it also, I think, connects to something Gabriel was mentioning earlier, because, as we think about these projects that are really just trying to solve a real problem, and it's not about, emphasizing the underlying technology, but, there's, I guess, this perennial question with companies sometimes where it's like, is this a problem that people know that they have? Like, have they explicitly identified that this is something that's important to them? And I'm sort of curious, maybe Gabriel, from your perspective, is that something that you see with some of the projects that are coming, that you're being exposed to? Are they having an education problem? Maybe like, it's maybe their users aren't necessarily going to adopt because of the Web3 underlying stack. But if it's also this kind of like really novel use case, how should these projects think about communicating their value proposition?
Yeah, that's a great question. It depends on who your customer is, right? Like, if you're going after like the hardcore Web3 crypto crowd who is highly experimental, has an extremely high threshold for pain, especially with bad documentation or onboarding and really bad, UX, then they kind of know what they're signing up for. And really, I think you can play into the novelty, or you can play into the newness, right? Like this ecosystem especially is all about the new, right? Like everybody wants to discover the hot new thing and then be able to talk about it on Twitter. And you almost see like this media influencer amplification play in our ecosystem, which I think a lot of really smart startups in the Web3 space can leverage to their advantage. And don't really need to lean into, maybe some of the more fundamental aspects of like building maybe a traditional Web2 company. But certainly if what you're building, if you believe your market size is a massive market, and you believe that the market that you're playing in can become a massive market, and you're simply using kind of this, the Web3 ecosystem as your initial beachhead, but then you want to expand beyond into other market segments, then you do eventually have to start thinking about some of those other components, the quality of the UX, the quality of the UI, especially DeFi. DeFi companies in particular, like we have a company in our last cohort, in our open finance cohort called PyDAO. They spent a lot, that team was really smart. They really understood traditional finance and DeFi. They were deep in the community. They built a really rich and robust community, but they also spent a tremendous amount of time on their brand and their UI. And the reason why that's important, especially when you start talking about DeFi, which for me is just FinTech 2.0, the bar of credibility in the mind of the consumer, like the legitimacy of you as a company, really matters when you start talking about things that matter, like people's money, right? And so, it really depends on your customer segment. You can get away with a lot with the early adopter crowd, and that can be a great beachhead for you, especially as you are exploring the problem space. Your early adopters will allow you to make a lot of mistakes as you explore the problem space. But as you start to move up the stack or cross the chasm, as Colin was referring to earlier, into larger and larger markets who are maybe less tolerant, you really have to empathize with them, that they are not on Twitter DeFi all day, and know the ins and outs of what's happening, and will put up with some of these bad elements.
I do want to emphasize what Gabriel said, though. We shouldn't discount the unbelievable power of having so many early adopters in the Web3 space. One of the industry segments that my last startup served was the construction industry. And boy, did you have to have like a very developed product before these late adopters decided to adopt it, right? And so the kinds of like innovation that, just having a whole group of early adopters in the same space working together with each other just catalyzes is incredible. And, I'm going to assume, and Gabriel pointed this out, the Tachyon cohort, for example, a lot of the first users that those companies are going to sell to or adopt are each other, like within the cohort, just because they're all early adopters, right? And so we shouldn't discount like how powerful that the fertility of that early adopter ethos is in the Web3 space.
Yeah, that is such an important point. I actually want to like touch on that a little bit. Like early companies are really scared to ship like a really bad version of their product, or especially in our space, like I've got to get my smart contracts audited, which yes, 100% you do. Definitely that's the case. But you have the luxury of being able to ship really bad products or do low fidelity ships early to try to learn from your users, especially in this ecosystem. And I think it's really important for Web3 companies to figure out how to leverage that. I had this obsession with two of our companies in the last program, and I have a feeling we're going to have the same thing in this cohort, where we were trying to get these companies to adopt no-code front-end solutions to validate some of their assumptions with early customers and early adopters before they went down this long, complicated, expensive smart contract audit path, only to figure out that, in fact, none of your users actually give a shit about what you're building right now. So I think I think this is true of all early adopter communities, but especially true of the Web3 early adopter community. Is there is a high threshold of pain, and we will put up with a lot because it's cool, right? Whenever I see like a cool project, when I saw Audius, I was like, oh, this is cool. I'll put up with the bad, no mobile app experience. I've got my YouTube music all set up and synced up and ready to go, or Spotify synced up and ready to go, but it's okay because this is really cool. I'm into this. Early stage companies in our space can really leverage that.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add to that. I think, definitely the early adopter space with the UX, and partly it's been supercharged by this crazy incentives that has been like going around in DeFi. Everyone's doing the whole liquidity mining, which is great in terms of like getting people like incentivized to do certain things. So that actually also accelerates the path to like validation. But I think, part of it's like we also need to be careful in terms of where exactly are the true users and the true community that will stay with you. So the people who think it's cool, but how do we then like translate that into the feedback, translate that into like, okay, is this actually solving a pain point? How often are you actually using it? What kind of features would you really, really solves your problem? So I think as a community or as an ecosystem, like I'm always trying to like talk to the founders, like, let's move towards that, right? Like look past like the initial like excitement, look past like the hype of like all this liquidity mining, look for the actual value in like building communities that will give you true feedback and users.
Yeah, 100%. We're brilliant with bootstrapping and needing to cross to the next phase of, as you say, building true users and true community. Totally agree. That's actually something, you know, I'm curious. I think a few of you sort of mentioned it earlier, but this idea of, you know, in the Web2 space, like people talk about, you know, a startup, like there's some notion of product market fit when a company is just starting out. What does that look like for Web3 projects? I think we don't really have, at least that I'm familiar with, you know, great frameworks for what is like protocol market fit, or, you know, or other notions around that, or for like open source projects. What does it really mean for like a project to kind of achieve that in Web3? Things that I'd be curious to hear everyone's thoughts, but
I'll take this.
Gabriel, yeah, go for it.
I'll do the first version. So the first thing is having a good problem. And a good problem has a couple of key elements to it, right? There's an insight there. There's a level of intensity. You know, it's you know, the analogy that's given is, are you selling an aspirin, or are you selling a vitamin? Right? A vitamin is like, hey, I'd love to be healthy, and you know, but an aspirin is like, I'm in pain. Solve my pain, right? And that's a really good problem. You know, how painful is it? How expensive is it to solve? Who is this a problem for? Is it a problem for a lot of people or a small group of people? I think once you kind of hone in on this problem, the second key element is, are you in a good market? And the thing about a good market is there's a time series to it, right? A good market it's growing, it's changing, it's evolving, right? And it can grow, change, and evolve into a very large market. And a market is just, you know, people transacting, you know, buying goods and services, right? So at the end of the day, is somebody willing to trade value in exchange for you solving that problem that you identified? And are there enough of them? And are the transaction sizes and the transaction frequencies and transaction amounts large enough to justify a very large business? A large market will solve a lot of problems for early stage companies. If you're kind of in a large space, in a large enough space, you can afford to make a lot of mistakes, especially in the early days. So I think those are some of the key elements around, you know, a good market. And then, you know, you have to have a differentiated solution. So, you know, the old adage is that there's no more white space, right? Like everybody's already thought about every potential problem that you could probably think of. But do you have a unique insight around this problem, right? Do you have a unique vantage point? Something, you know, either that you've experienced yourself, or you've just talked to enough customers who have experienced this problem that you've kind of like pattern recognized across a bunch of people and gone, oh, it's not this. Everybody thinks it's this. It's really that. And then build your product around that. I think those are the core components, I think, with product market fit. When those kind of things line up and fit together, that's when you find the elusive product market fit.
Colin, you want to go, or?
Go for it.
Yeah, so fully agree with everything that Gabriel has mentioned. So then what are some of the signs to look for to know that, have I really kind of hit it, right? And that's where like the continuous iteration is really important, and watching certain metrics are really important. So I think, like I mentioned before, like we're looking past like the initial hype of the launch or like a token issuance, for example. We need to look at like, is there like actual organic growth? Is there like actual usage of the actual product that is itself kind of like increasing over time in terms of engagement, frequency, volume, and all that? So there needs to be this like type feedback loop that people look at, instead of like just focusing on your product vision. There needs to it needs to be in touch with who you're trying to reach out to and whether you're actually solving that pain point. So that's why, you know, exactly like Gabriel mentioned before, sometimes you don't even need a full product. You need, like we always like to talk about, like even before you start, you can have a landing page, you can talk to customers. And once you start building, you can have a minimum viable product. You can have a roadmap. And after that, involve your users and then the iteration and improvement of all those things.
I'd go a step further than that. And I would say articulation is your first product, right?
Yes.
Before you even start building anything, if you can't articulate the problem and who this is a problem for and what your solution is, you don't need to be building. And so really, like, content is your first product, or articulation is your first product.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Gabriel and Shikai. Like, that all of that is basically, you know, kind of the fundamentals that you have to get right as a business in the Web3 space. I think the one thing I would add is what might be unique to Web3 more so than anything is after you figure out that initial, you know, aspirin versus vitamin and that product market fit, how do you leverage the token economics of the underlying infrastructure that you're using to scale way more rapidly than you could in a Web2 context? Because that is so unique to Web3 and has such intense incentive mechanisms and such interesting ways to hack two-sided networks and markets and things like that, that might be one additional layer that once you figure out the core value proposition, how do you scale it in a differentiated way?
Yeah, 100%. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I think some of these ideas of like the unscalable initial tests that projects can run to validate whether there's like something there, or they're solving for a real problem. You mentioned a few of those. Is there something? I mean, because I think one thing that's kind of interesting with Web3 is that you know, and also when you're like talking to the early adopters and folks who are just going to try something because it's new, how do you differentiate between like signal that's coming in these like early tests from people who are interested because it's exciting versus people who are there because, you know, it's really solving a problem that they have, a real problem that they have? I don't know. Yeah, go for it. Shikai, sorry.
Yeah, I think yes, I think if we only look at the numbers of, say, all the TVL or all the number of users, the number of token holders, it's easy to be deceived and say like, wow, we have so much adoption, or like, you know, our market cap is such. But it becomes really obvious when you talk to the actual users or the token holders of each of these protocols, right? Like, are they just concerned about whether your token price is going to go up? Or are they asking, hey, when's your next feature coming out? Like, oh, hey, this particular like UX or like this journey was not great for me. Or like, hey, are you going to integrate this other thing so that I can use it in all these other ways too? When is your mobile version or anything of those coming out? And when you actually talk to users, it becomes obvious then, like, you know, whether the people are actually using your product or they're just there to like speculate and like join the hype or like profit from your growth.
Yeah, I had this rule of thumb that, you know, threaten to take it away and see how your users react, right? And so, you know, we have this awesome developer tooling platform called Textile and Filecoin. Now, I think in the hundreds of applications now rely on them to use Filecoin to store data. If they said, hey, guys, we're no longer doing this, how many of those users would say, oh my God, what are you doing to my business and to my organization and to my user base, right? And so just, it's hard to simulate that test for real, but you know, you can find different ways to get at that same message.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and actually just a little bit related to that, but switching gears to something you mentioned before, Colin, this idea of leveraging some of the, you know, the token economics and some of the mechanisms there to really bootstrap that initial market and that initial community. I'm curious if there are some like models for fundraising and monetization that you've seen that are unique to Web3 that are like most, you know, really exciting to you, that maybe break the mold a little bit, that you think kind of ties into, yeah, like both being a really great business model and also a really great mechanism for growing initial community.
Yeah, I think both DeFi and kind of the initial ICO iteration did many things to disrupt, both venture capital and traditional finance. And so, you could access capital and use capital in different ways than you couldn't have before. And so that's kind of from a fundraising perspective a little bit. But I also think like hacking the actual underlying components of the product and the stack is important too. So for example, the underlying token economics of the Filecoin network have enabled, in just 2 months, I believe, 500 petabytes of storage to join the network. And that is enormous. That is, think of storing 150 million HD movies or like 100 times the Netflix library, or streaming together like over 1 million MacBook Pros, right? That is enormous. And all of those miners are now bidding to acquire you as a client if you have an application that's storing lots of data or a little bit of data onto the network. And so that's like a fundamental economic disparity versus kind of the traditional Web2 cloud storage providers that you can leverage in your business to expand and prove out a completely different value proposition. And so that's kind of how I think about it. Like, it's fundraising is one thing, and there's some like really interesting paradigms that are shifting, particularly in the Ethereum space. But there are just other kind of ways to kind of redefine your stack and your value proposition using the fundamental economics of Web3 protocols.
Yeah, definitely agree. Gabriel, I'm curious, like from, also your experience with broader Web3 and DeFi specifically, have you seen, I don't know, what are some of the more interesting models that you've seen that are using, that just have like interesting takes on using like crypto economics to bootstrap initial communities?
I think for me, like governance tokens were probably one of the coolest mechanisms that are native to the Web3 space, right? All of a sudden you take your advocates, you take your community, you take your builders, and you let them participate in, where the project goes and the upside of the project. Being able to tokenize the governance mechanisms of some of these projects and really put it into the hands of the community and say, we trust you to help us continue to move this in the direction that you see fit, I think is just really amazing. And then, what we're starting to see now with fair launch mechanisms, kind of taking it to its next level, I think is just really interesting and really fascinating, right? Like, this is the thing that, when Uber IPO'd, everybody, talked about that they really slipped up on is how did they not give their drivers who built that company, built that network, early stock in that IPO or stock in that IPO. Like that, it just I think for those of us in Web3 now, that just seems like it would have been a no-brainer. And those type of mechanisms are now available, starting off in the Web3 ecosystem. But I think that's going to be one of those unique killer features that's going to make its way into the broader web. Because it just makes so much sense. I mean, Web 2 is kind of like jumping through all these hoops to try to get there. There's like points or crazy loyalty rewards for customers and stuff like that. Like it's nonsense. Like you're going to start to see some of these mechanisms make their way into traditional Web 2 businesses, and so I think that's like, for me, that's super cool.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe adding a bit to that. So we've been really excited with the governance tokens launches as well. And a lot of people are asking like, hey, what's the value capture of these tokens? Like, why are you just issuing it? There's no value, it's completely an experiment. But actually governance in itself is a form of value because you essentially are the network. You form part of the network. And then so it's really hard to price that because it's not something that we really have in the traditional space. I guess equity is some form of an equivalent, but usually equity is also backed by some financial metrics. So just a form of governance is a form of value capture. And therefore, like that has been really effective as a form of, you can say like bootstrapping or kind of like fundraising. If you issue some tokens and some of them come back to the network and that forms your pool of be it treasury or like funds that you can use to incentivize. Essentially, that is fundraising, right? Because what do you need the funds for? You usually need the funds to grow. You need the funds to sustain the network. So if you can use that by issuing a token, like you don't need the funds to come in. You can just straight away start like distributing it. And that's the beauty of Web3.
Yep, 100%. See lots of agreement from the group. That's great. Yeah, totally agree. I have a bit of a different direction for these next few minutes. I was curious, we talk a lot in sort of traditional business, I guess, about the idea of first mover advantages. And, lots of people in crypto, I think, and in Web3 have, different opinions on, oh, can there be like one chain to rule them all? Or like, what is the model of the world that we think is most likely to exist? But I'm curious, just given the state of what the space looks like overall, what would you say to someone who's like looking to build a new project for the first time? Are there first mover advantages that like people should that maybe have already been captured, and so maybe people should like steer clear of certain subsets of this industry or certain parts, like certain layers of the stack? Are there like certain areas where there still is a lot of like first mover advantage type value to be gained, and so maybe people should think about starting their businesses there? Yeah, so how do you think about that in the context of Web3? Colin, I would curious your thoughts first, maybe.
Yeah, I do go back to my crossing the chasm framework, and we're so early that it's just impossible to tell. There's so many more experiments that need to be run before we can decide on the answer to that question on whether there is a first mover or not. But I would default back to the paradigms of the early Web 1 movement. And how many of the companies from the early 90s and Web 1 do you see around today? Like, not very many. There was a whole hype cycle and a whole user development cycle, and people were saying the same things back then. I'm just quite not old enough, but just on the cusp to remember some of that, where people were like, oh, we've missed the internet boom and we'll never catch this wave again, and it's too late to enter now. Yet a whole different wave of innovation entered. So I definitely think it's just the beginning. There's a whole lot of room to grow and a whole lot of experimentation to be had.
Yep.
Yeah.
So in terms of first mover, I would say it's not necessarily an advantage. I would say it's a strategic decision to become the first mover in a particular niche. Well, I do think you do get certain benefits, right? The early network effects, you get to build the community early, and if you can continue to innovate based on that feedback, and then the community becomes stickier, and then you get certain Lindy effect as it exists across a certain period of time. So you do get all of that. But also, everybody needs to be aware of the trade-offs, right? Which is like, being the first mover, you are taking the burden of like innovating and figuring out what actually works in this space. And then because most of the space is quite open source, it's quite transparent, people can actually copy those ideas. People can literally take parts of your code and just like fork it or like just modify it, add certain components to it. And that's the innovation part. So there are trade-offs that come with it. But if you can tap into like the early growth benefits, that's certainly very powerful.
I don't have much. I agree with both those statements. Maybe the one or two places that I would say there might be a true first mover advantage in this space, even though it is definitely early days, is dev tools and infra. I think those are probably going to be pretty locked in by the early users and the first users into that space. But short of that, I think it's wide open territory.
Yeah, as Colin was saying before, let's ask all these folks, who are building on top of all these tools, like, well, how would you feel if these are taken away? Probably a lot of people would be pretty unhappy today. So totally agree. The great perspectives there. So I think, we have about 10 minutes left, and I'd love to move to audience questions in a minute. But really quickly, before we close this portion, I just wanted to maybe just open it up to all of you. Is there any, like, if you could leave one parting thought with, new builders in the space, what would it be?
Could I start with a shameless plug?
Yes, go for it.
Yes. So starting a new company is really, or a new project is never easy. And it always helps to have people around you to be supporting you on this journey, be on a tech side, people on the partnership side, customer side, and also having fellow builders in the same like environment, in the same like mindset as you. So with that, I would say joining accelerator or group of cohorts actually is a fantastic way to get started. And right now we're recruiting for the Filecoin Frontier Accelerator from where we're going to be based in Singapore. We welcome everybody globally to join us, and we love to support you on your journey.
The standard advice, I love that plug, by the way. Our program just launched. I got nothing to plug here. The advice that I give founders in both Web 2 and Web 3 all the time is the difference between a project and a startup is a customer. If you just remember that and make that your focal point, like truly understand who you're building for. What are their pain points? What do they need? What are their fears? What are their anxieties? What are their greeds? Like if you truly understand the underpinnings of your users and your customers, you're going to go very far.
And my statement will be pretty simple. It's that the next generation of Web3 depends on you as builders. And you have the opportunity to help this whole space cross the chasm into the early majority, to embed your own values in the code that you write, and to be able to build applications that reach billions of people. And so we're counting on you.
Awesome. Those are great. Thank you so much. Awesome. And maybe while we're, looks like there are some questions that have been asked on YouTube. Could I ask someone to maybe collect those questions somewhere so that we can repeat them? In the meantime, there were some questions that we got from folks that were submitted in advance. So I'll maybe go to those first. So the first one is a question from Marco Rodriguez of Volterra. And he asks, how do you plan to align incentives between what I call, or he calls, the sandwich problem? At the bottom of the sandwich are service providers and internet infrastructure providers that have been built over the last 20 years. And in the last 5 years especially, this infrastructure has become highly centralized by design to optimize for costs and for accessing FANG content providers. The industry is commoditized and facing margin compression. And on the other hand, on the top of the sandwich, you have the cloud and content providers. So the question is, why would people move away from these providers given their momentum? I don't know if someone has immediate thoughts on this. What do you think, Shikai?
This seems to be quite a directed question to. It sounds like a Web 2 question. Pardon my comment. But I think that, yeah, for sure. I mean, the providers and the platforms are like squeezing more traditional companies. I think like that's exactly where Web3 provides the white space for you to then build on, right? Because the infrastructure is there, and there are various components of the infrastructure that are at various degrees of decentralization. The applications are there at various degrees of decentralization as well. And there's the bridge between the Web 2 and Web 3. So, and there's this opportunity to kind of recreate that full stack of the full tech web stack. And in a way, it is needed because when an asset or when interaction is kind of blockchain native, you do need that full stack that is Web3 native. So I would say, yeah, like why not look at this Web3 native stack? And that could present a lot of interesting sets of problems for you to solve, and also a lot of freedom for you to then navigate this.
Awesome. And Gabriel, did I see you maybe had thoughts here?
I just, there's some assumptions in that statement that maybe I don't quite agree with, especially in emerging tech. You have what I would refer to as the evolutionaries and the revolutionaries, right? So the revolutionaries are like all the startups. They're disruptive, they're innovative. They want to come in and take market share from the large incumbents. But then you have the large incumbents that realize that if they don't innovate and disrupt themselves, somebody else is going to do it and take their business. And so they're the evolutionaries. They realize that they need to evolve their business and involve their business models, involve their stack. And so I see there's not so much of an incentive alignment issue. It's just, there's just a lot of building that needs to take place. And it's a matter of momentum and progress.
Yep, definitely. Awesome. And then I think we have another pre-submitted question from Charles Cow, who's the CEO of Nebula AI Inc. And he asked, what does support look like for app developers? What are future channels for application developer teams to get funding? And I think probably everyone here has lots of things to say and to maybe additionally plug. So Colin, do you want to start with this one?
It's just an incredible platform of folks that are entering the market, and there's tremendous amounts of support, all from hackathons like ETH Global and HackFS and other things like that that allow folks to experiment and learn and develop something in a prototype stage, to folks like Gitcoin, who run like 6 to 8 week accelerators where you just get a little bit of mentorship and you're trying to get a product to an MVP where you have a couple customers, to the unbelievable and incredibly powerful accelerators that Gabriel and Shikai run, that take that initial MVP and teach you how to scale it into a real business and a real kind of organization. And so there's just the full spectrum. There's lots of opportunities to learn, build, and launch across the Web3 stack, and really encourage folks to take advantage of those.
Yeah, I think Colin covered most of it. If I can recap the plug slightly as well, there is a $20,000 grant that comes with the Filecoin Frontier Accelerator. So that's a little perk to keep in mind. And there's also a 1 million pool of funds for follow-on investment that's like parked and ready for you to access by the middle or the end of the program, not to mention the full investor network that we'll bring in as well, and the user bases who may be participating in your crowdfunding. So the avenues are there. We're here for you.
Awesome. Gabriel, I know the Tachyon cohort just started. Yeah, okay.
But finance and fundraising is built into the stack of Web3. So no shortage of opportunities depending on where your project is.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Awesome. And then, so we have a question from YouTube as well. So this question is, at what point in the Filecoin roadmap will it be ready to onboard major Web2 websites? Colin, do you want to take this one?
I'll say my answer, and then why don't you say your answer, Pooja? So obviously you can launch a website on Filecoin today. I highly recommend you check out Slate as one really awesome example of a website, or use Space from Fleek, which allows you to deploy websites onto IPFS Filecoin, and many other services like that. But I think the question is basically saying, when can like YouTube be supported by Filecoin, like a really major site with a lot of data? And my answer to that would be, we actually are starting to build the capacity that can support those types of websites. Like, in just 2 months, 500 petabytes of information has been onboarded to the network. And so if you continue at that rate, we'd be in the exabytes within a year or so, which is absolutely enormous. And so I think from a scalability perspective, we're getting pretty close to support pretty mainstream websites. We need to kind of build the tooling and some of the other functionality that's required that those websites are used to in an existing environment like AWS or Google Cloud and things like that, and make a few other optimizations in the Filecoin protocol to kind of get there. So all that said, I would predict 6 months, but I defer to Pooja, who also knows a lot about that.
I think that's great. I love that you named a time frame. That's awesome. We should do that. Yeah, I think it's awesome. Or like, all of the topics that we're talking about are definitely true in the case of Filecoin as well, where we're thinking about, what are the early adopters of Filecoin, and who are they? What are the problems that we're trying to solve for them? How do we build initial really compelling stories of success while we're building the easy to use developer tooling and everything, so that in a few months time or a few quarters time, we have both a lot of, demonstrated success with like early adopters, and also really much more robust tooling, so that we can start to tackle like broader use cases beyond Web3 as well. So I think everything Colin said, +1, working on it, and hopefully very soon. Awesome. And I think we have our last question, which I'm not sure, I think this maybe was potentially directed at Filecoin, but I think it's like I'm going to just generalize it to Web3 more broadly. So what are the biggest roadblocks to Web3 adoption? Is it fiat on-ramps, or wallet complexity, something else? Gabriel, do you want to start this one?
I think Web3 is still looking for its killer use case. That makes it mainstream adoptable. I think we've belabored the point of like finding a problem, what makes a good problem, so on and so forth. But, when you think about the killer use cases of like Web3 technology, censorship resistance, decentralized and distributed, there are a couple of applications that you can start to imagine, and then layering in some maybe new and interesting business models that would make it mass adoption, viable. And we're super close. I've seen a lot of interesting projects. There are a couple that I'm really excited about that I think might have that potential. Filecoin is one of them. Yeah, we're coming. We're getting there. It's coming.
Yep. So I think for Web3 adoption, we've been talking about mass adoption for years now. And I don't think it's gonna be one kind of killer app or like one protocol that's gonna like help do it. It needs to be everybody working in concerted effort in your own initiatives, right? If we think about like how, for example, Uber needed to take off, it's not the app itself. Like you needed the whole internet, right? You needed the GPS, you needed smartphones, mobile apps, you needed the payments for all of that. So all of these components were built before Uber even came, before you even thought about, like people even dreamed about it, or maybe like it couldn't have existed without it. So I would say, mass adoption will come eventually, but everybody needs to do our part. Bring a new user, make a particular feature, build a particular tooling, build whatever it is that will bring users and improve the experience and improve the whole stack in terms of what is needed. And together we'll proceed there. Like maybe it takes years, maybe it takes months, who knows, right?
Yeah, it's a great last comment. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to everyone for participating and those who attended. I think this has been a really, really amazing conversation, and hopefully it will be useful for new builders in the space. If folks want to learn more about the three of you, or like connect with you online or learn more about your programs, where should they go? What are like the best places to find you online?
I'm on Twitter. You can find me at Gabriel Anderso. Drop the in.
Same here, Colin Everett on Twitter.
Yes, Dashikai here on Twitter.
Amazing. Awesome. And also for those who may not know, Filecoin Mainnet, the launch ignition moment is this Thursday, and we have a huge number of really exciting events that are planned next week. We're calling this event Liftoff Week. Colin knows all about it, but if you're watching this, please join. There's going to be so much to learn next week, and really, really excited for everyone to join us for that. Thank you so much. See you later. Bye.
Thanks, Pooja.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Pooja.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pooja.
Bye.